talking about myself, I just wanted to go into right to the topic of today's presentation. And I have requested Laura and Dushon to look after the chat and the participants and let me know if there is anything that I need to know as I go on, and particularly when we start the discussion. And I hope you're hearing me well. And I am basically, this is the presentation that I want to make: educational research and knowledge production in post-Soviet Central Asia. Now, today I want to talk about part one, which is conceptual issues. As you know, that the original title has conceptual and methodological questions, and I will say why later. So thank you for, so the first thing I want to say, why is educational research and knowledge production? Why are we talking about this? And I'm sure that many of you who are educators, social scientists, and scholars in general know that education research or research in social sciences, as well as knowledge production. And knowledge production could be much broader than what we sometimes understand education research. Is critically important for making informed, relevant, contextually relevant, sustainable policy decisions, policy making at the top level, but also decision making by teachers at classroom level. And general populace also can benefit from this. So, but it is also critically important, particularly social science research, in terms of independence, decolonization, identity formation of the new nation states. And given that some of them are also, and Central Asia has quite a significant, if not majority, Muslim population, this education research is critically important also for relocating and repositioning these countries within the Islamic Ummah. And it is very interesting to know that Central Asia was critically central to the knowledge production among the in the history of Islam. And we will speak about this later in more critical, constructive way. But I just wanted to say how important it is, not just for teachers, but also for general cultural, political, economic, and geopolitical reasons. Of course, education research is important for economic, social, and cultural development, for self-esteem and feeling of a worthwhile member in the global community of nations, for developing sustainable, culturally responsive solutions to educational social problems, such as, for example, we have privatization going on for so many years, credit system, competency-based education, child-centered pedagogy, trilingualism, and other so-called global best practices that have been sweeping Central Asia and being placed or being used and applied for almost like more than 2 decades. And we still don't know a lot about what their effects are and how they're working. But it's also important for more basic questions of dropout, access, quality, inequalities that are oftentimes disguised under terms such as meritocracy, quality, and diversification. So education research is important for improving quality, for making education relevant, for resolving questions of teacher shortage, status, image, correlation between education and jobs, for questions of freedom, democracy, authoritarianism, exclusivist nationalism, religiosity, particularly radicalism. And we know that Central Asia is also struggling with this question. And then also economic and social and environmental malaises, such as infectious diseases that we see one of them today ravaging the whole world. And we know that the solution will have to come from not education, but general research. That is why it's important to understand, and including education research is important in this, in understanding, in managing, and in working, and possibly fighting with COVID. And we know why education research is important. But also, I want to speak that I became personally interested in the question of education research from my personal experience when I joined the Aga Khan University in Karachi. At that place, I was introduced to some of the very interesting ideas, such as cooperative learning, controversy, Bloom's taxonomy, and many other things that came from Canada, from London, UK, etc., etc. And what mesmerized me was that they were so well prepared, these ideas. They were so beautifully presented. And all of us got obsessed with them. We used them. And I particularly used cooperative learning and controversy as my research topic. And I failed in applying it, bitterly failed. And what was interesting to me simultaneously as I was thinking about this, I then said, how are these ideas produced? Not that what they were, not the what, but the how. How someone produced cooperative learning in so beautiful way. Bloom's taxonomy, controversy, and so on. But because, as I said, that I also did not succeed in implementing my approach, which was controversy in cooperative learning, I also became interested in the context, why it did not work. So this how question of its production and why question of its workability and practicality made me very interested not just in ideas, but how they are produced. In other words, in research and knowledge production. But I also argue that knowledge production and research cannot be done without development of a vision, strategy, and capacity and structures in place. Nazarbayev, University of Central Asia. Someone muted me. I don't know why. Can you unmute me, please? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good, because sorry about this. Okay, so as I said, that there are some structures in place in Central Asia, but they are very limited, and we will talk about it later. So development of research and capacities should be a priority task for the above reasons. And in so doing, we have to work with, despite and against global best practices in research. So these are my key arguments and positioning myself within this presentation so that you know why am I interested in it, why is this important, and why is it particularly important for Global South, including places like Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Pakistan, and other Afghanistan, and so on, the Central Asian and South Asian states. So the data sources and analysis for this particular presentation comes from sociology of education courses that I offered in Tajikistan, but also I was director or dean of the Institute for Educational Development of the Aga Khan University, of which you have representatives such as Dushan Shamatov and Miravzal Tajik at the Nazarbayev University. I was their teacher for a short time, but I also was mentor for them, and we became buddies. And today I am again very happy to see both of them there organizing this presentation for me. And when I was in Pakistan at the Aga Khan University, there was a very clear message from His Highness, the Chancellor of the Aga Khan, that the solutions to the problem of Pakistan should ultimately come from Pakistan. Essentially, what it meant is that while we are engaging with global best practices, we will have to develop local capacities to develop solutions from within. And this is true of Central Asia. There's the sustainable, contextually relevant solutions to the problems of Central Asia should come from Central Asia. And I'm sure Nazarbayev University of Central Asia, otherwise also the state universities in Central Asia are doing this. So, so then education research and so there was, currently I'm involved in education research and evidence-based policy consultancy projects in Tajikistan. And yes, is there something? Hello? Was someone saying something? I'm sorry, there's heard some noise. But anyway, so the other source of my knowledge is the education, research, and evidence-based policy making workshops and trainings and research that I'm doing in Tajikistan with European Union for the last 2 years. I have also, as part of it, done some review of work And I also did, I also offer a course, but I will speak about that later. So there are publications on education in Central Asia that I'm using, particularly some of them that I was co-author, and you see them: lessons from implementation of teacher education reforms in Pakistan, globalization on the margins. There are many studies, many research that I have reviewed and studied and taken note of, are called decolonization studies, post-colonial studies, post-socialist studies. And I offer a very interesting course at the Toronto University, at my institute, which is called Education Research and Knowledge Production in Comparative International Education Context. I have wonderful students. Indeed, one of the auditors, participants in my course was from Kazakhstan, Danayarova from Almaty, and she took the course from here. And it is a course that we engage with a lot of these talks that I'm going to make today. So I will also today focus only on conceptual issues for a number of reasons, because of, as I said, decolonization studies. And the decolonization studies includes people like Edward Said, Santos, Mignolo from Latin America, Mahbubani Kishore, who is a South Asian, I think from Singapore, Farid Alatas from Malaysia, Spivak, Adib Khaled, who actually is Pakistani but lives in Canada, Artomi Kalinovsky, who produced a recent book on decolonization, and many others. Then there is indigenization and anti-imperialism studies, particularly by people like Linda Tinhua Smith, who speaks about Maori experiences in Australia and in Oceania. Then Afrocentrism, studies of Afrocentrism or African centrism by people like George Day, Abachi, Lumumba, Odore, and so on. There are lots of studies that talk about these issues that I'll be speaking come from Islamization perspective, particularly Naguib Alatas from Malaysia, Ziauddin Sardar, Pakistani, Ashraf Hussain, Bangladesh, Chandra Muzaffar, again, Malaysia, and there are many others of them that I know about and study. And then of course, post-socialist and post-Soviet studies, people like Hedeta Silova, you all know, Sarah Amsler, who worked in Kyrgyzstan, and very interesting book of the politics of knowledge that I will be referring to. Steiner Hamsi, also very well known in Central Asia. And more interesting person is a very provocative thinker called Madina Tlostanova from Moscow. I will be referring to some of her thoughts to provoke you guys to a debate and discussion. Not necessarily agree with her, but it's important that we know of such writing exists in the post-socialist context. And then there are research on policy borrowing and transfer and comparative international education. Again, you know about Steiner Hamsi, Silova, Alan DeYoung, many other things, many other people, but there are also perhaps I just wonder if I know that there is Eurasianism movement, which is also, I have little knowledge about, but I know that it exists. And also, I don't know if there is any Central Asianism exists, but in the globalization on the margins, we talked about the necessity of having a collaboration and united strategic approach by the Central Asian scholars within and without, that talks about these issues. So what are the key concepts? The key concepts and theories and framework include post-colonial condition as hegemonic colonialism. In other words, I will speak about this later, but this is the concept. Academic dependency and imperialism. Hello? Conceptual and methodological approaches to talk about. Policy borrowing, the idea of best practices, borrowing policies, the idea of colonization of mind, captive mind, methodological imperialism, coloniality of knowledge, disciplinary decadence, zero-point epistemology, and then interesting questions that were put by people like Walter Mignolo. Can non-Europeans think? And this was largely about Latin Americans and people who come from Latina background. And then Kishore Mahbubani wrote a book, a whole book on Can Asians Think? And then Tolostanova wrote a chapter, Can Post-Soviets Think? And we know about Spivak's much earlier writing, Can Subaltern Think and Talk? So all these are very important things about alternative approaches and pluralization of knowledge production, including methods of research. And there are studies, there are articles that Can Africans think? So then the other concepts are epistemic, suggestions are made, epistemic disobedience, epistemic break, delinking with the Eurocentrism, indigenization, culturally responsive pedagogy and research. And Eurocentrist research is considered as narrow in capturing human experience because of its focus on empiricism, logical positivism, and purely scientific focus. So what are the summary discussions? The summary discussions from these concepts and studies is that the current research and knowledge production is grounded in Western, secular, Eurocentrist ontology, which is also an epistemology and methodology and techniques and methods. Its production and application in other parts of the world therefore leads to unsustainable solutions, but more importantly to coloniality of knowledge, which is consisting of the fact that all models of cognition and thinking, seeing and interpreting the world and people, the subject-object relations, the organization of disciplinary divisions entirely depend on the norms and rules created and imposed by the Western modernity since 16th century and offered to humankind as universal, delocalized, and disembodied. What are the other discussions? The Islamization discourse suggests the need, there are different types of Islamization, but I want to say that to just bring all of that, and if we have need, we can discuss it later. But it suggests the need for decoupling some of the more, like I would say, strong or conservative forms of it would suggest complete decoupling and rejecting the West as secular. People like Farouki, Ismail, Chandra, Muzaffar, and others have suggested this particularly. And then return to Islamic ontology and epistemology and look for solutions in Islam. But in so doing, they romanticize the Islamic as the indigenous. And then they fall into this homogenizing the West, which is also called Orientalism in reverse, and then blame the West and the secular for their own problem, particularly happening with people like Zardar, contributing in so doing in some of these extremist views or some of these too radical Islamization views contribute to the clash of civilization from reverse. But to also suggest that we should borrow from the past, and in borrowing, do not engage with the past critically. But in reality, those who suggest Islamic solution deal with Islam as reconstructed, appropriated, and tailored to today's time. They also have methods such as we know, ijtihad, qiyas, ijma, halaqa, and so on, which have been largely used in legalistic and linguistic terms. And some of them suggest that these could be used in science, in medicine, others are saying not. So the debate continues. And then there are others who simply say we can take any idea from anywhere and filter it through ethical and religious prism and see how whether it challenges the supremacy of Islamic thought and Islamic precepts and values or not, and then take it and use it to the benefit of Muslim Ummah. So I just wanted to move on, but there is important thing is that there are some, as I said, there is a diversity within the Islamization perspective, and some of them have suggested that Muslims must examine Muslim tradition, and then they should first examine Muslim traditions, and then second Western traditions, and create something new. Again, people like Fazlur Rahman suggested this, but also Farouki, interestingly, supported this idea. So I'll be speaking right now about what exists in post-Soviet Central Asia, some sketches in terms of research, and then focus on case of Tajikistan, but it might be relevant to the rest of it. Now, of course, we have pre-Islamic time, and we also have Islamic approaches to research. Now, the Islamic and pre-Islamic time, the purpose of research, of course, was superiority of religious sciences, Islamic knowledge, and Islam generally, unquestionable superiority. And we know the work of Al-Ghazali, his book, particularly Revival of Religious Sciences, in which he fought with philosophers and others to prove this, what he called superiority of Islam and religious sciences. Then there is a clear relationship between religion and state, between a relationship of research with religion and with the state. So research is subservient to religion. In very rare case, it questions the religious knowledge, the sanctity of religious knowledge. So it really accommodates itself within that framework. Some of them go into sectarian analysis, but also in terms of education, Islamic thought produced quite some of the very important ideas such as ilm, talim, tarbiyah, adab, which are Arabic words, but are used in Central Asia very, very widely, and they were used even in the Soviet time. And then we also know about Jadidism in Central Asia, particularly in the territories of current Uzbekistan and a little bit of Tajikistan, who tried to modernize Islamic knowledge and kind of accommodate it with what was coming from Enlightenment and modernity. Of course, there are, in the broader research, there are textual studies, travelogues, the medical research that talk about observation, talk about some more common, like ethnographic note-taking. We know about, for example, Nasir Khusraw's Safarnama, which is quite well known in Tajikistan, medical research by Ibn Sina, and today particularly it's resurfaced how Ibn Sina in his time proposed and enforced ideas of quarantine or karantin in Russian, and so on. So in other words, there is a wealth of knowledge there that needs to be unpacked, that needs to be critically engaged, but we have little knowledge about all this. I will speak about this later, how this all came up in my interviews and courses in Tajikistan. Then we have Soviet-style research, particularly in terms of candidate doctoral studies, books, monographs, and so on, which the ultimate aim was to prove superiority of Marxism, Leninism, and dialectical and historical materialism. And they also had tight relationship with the state and party. Research was, there were all kind of research in psychology, pedagogy, and didactics. But what is interesting is, but also role of social environment and class-based analysis. We know in the West, for example, ideas of Vygotsky, of social constructivism, Leontief, Luria, and others. Sorry? So use of course, this scholarship in Central Asia used largely Russian language, but it's important to know that there were some writings at the school level and at the district level, what was called teachers' best practice writing, where teachers and Methodists were writing about their experience, which was quite relevant. So the Soviets, like the West, created academies and institutions and schools on the periphery. Many of the locals, similar to those trained by the West in their colonies, do not see themselves as colonized mind, do not see themselves as reproducing Russian and Western hegemonies. Russians and Soviets, like Islam prior to them, dismissed local ways of producing knowledge and replaced them with modern Western. Now, this is in particular with the Russian and Soviet ones. So the disregard of what was indigenous and what was local prior to them is seen here, in terms of we need to understand that the Soviet and Russian experience was also involved in this. So further on, during the time of independence, quite a strong quite a strong rise was done to ethnopedagogy with nationalism or national orientation. Studies into culture, history, and tradition, ideas of patriotism, nationalism, are very common in education research in all over Central Asia, including places like Tajikistan. Anthologies have been produced, research questions, research topics. In my work with Central Asia, particularly Tajik scholars, brings all these important the topics. Now, it is important that we know that these countries are creating nation states, and therefore it is important for them to look into their tradition and history to find what existed there as part of indigenization, or so-called colonization, but also as part of building nation states. However, we need to be careful as terms of whether these searches are pulling us back or whether these searches are creating inequalities. So the questions of equity as well as the question of future or past is critical in engaging with this research. Now, almost none of these use English literature. So some of them are sociometric, some of them are quasi-experiential studies. I particularly looked at work of Bulbul Juma and know what he's written, quite strong research within these frameworks. So these post-Soviet scholars, as for the reformed Soviet social scientists, according to Tlostanova now, to whom I referred above, and many of whom were quite critical in their ideological and cognitive stance, they have become post-structuralist, structural functionalist, civilizational theorists, and Bourdieusian overnight, yet often continue suffering from typically positivist Soviet Marxist principles of cognition, making their discourses a bit outdated from the start. This is a critique. This critique is done by Tlostanova as well as by Sarah Ansler. What happened in terms of conceptual framework of post-Soviet independence scholars? It's a kind of an eclectic mesh in which they have become so within overnight, as she says. Now let's look at the second thing. While the post-Soviets abandoned Marxist-Leninist epistemology and ideology as guiding frameworks for data analysis, they are now using a hodgepodge, eclectic approach, jumbling together contradictory ideas of Western progressives and neoliberals, neo-imperialists and Eurasianist scholarships in their research, which results in inability to situate their research in the broader scholarship as well as inability to contribute new knowledge. Still on typology of post-Soviet research. Now there is also, in addition to local research in Central Asia that I briefly described, there is a Western-driven, which divides into two parts. One is done by NGOs, bilateral, multilateral, and other organizations, where local scholars are data collectors and report producers, where the key ideas and themes are defined by global thoughts and respond to external interests and needs, but sometimes they are quite locally also appreciated. Issues such as gender, Islamic extremism, competency-based, and so on. And these are also quite a lot of monitoring and evaluation studies. There is a little conceptual, there is some, but not deep conceptual discussions there. More are survey, quantitative, highly focused studies on particular topics, in which random sampling techniques are defined not only as objective, but also apolitical and democratic. Random sampling techniques, this characterization of quantitative methods, in turn, is associated with stylized image of Western democracy and contrasted to methods used by sociologists in what we are defined as traditional, unscientific, and backward society. Now, Bai Basunov, I think, is a Kazakh scholar who has spoken about this. Okay, so just one second. So there is also very important academic research done by scholars in the Western academia on Central Asia. This includes former scholars in Western academia, Soviet scholars, but also includes post-Soviet graduates of Western universities. And one of the very recent book that was produced is this one, and we presented it recently, Globalization on the Margins, which has 30 authors, of whom 15, almost like 12, 13 to 15 are former Central Asians or current Central Asians, including those from Nazarbayev University and Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and so on. So these kind of books are produced, they are important, but they're not accessible to local education policymakers. But what is interesting also that until very recently, the degrees obtained in the Western academies were not seen as valuable and not acknowledged in the Soviet and post-Soviet academy and scholarship. But overall, Sabzalieva Emma has done a research on this, and she says that this international research collaboration, instead of pluralizing knowledge and creating new ways of knowing, have given rise to a global science that has not significantly changed the existing knowledge hierarchies, and so on. So, in other words, within these, now let's read a few more because these are important. Any scholars in elaborating their own critical post-Soviet theory formulated from the border position between the Western and Soviet Russian modernity and coloniality without subscribing to any of the Western frameworks are immediately marginalized. Central Asian researchers mostly agreed on the continuing discrimination and Orientalism in relation to themselves in Western-dominated academia, yet refused to question the generally accepted Western scientific terminology and approaches rather defending them as presumably objective and uncontaminated by locality and of ideology, and silently agreed that knowledge is always produced in the West. The post-Soviet scholars, whether working in the former Soviet Union or even West, do not have visibility, cannot challenge the Western post-Soviet narratives of the Soviet Union, narrative of the Soviet Union countries. The post-Soviet space and social sciences and scientists for the rest of the world, and the refusal of the global North to accept the post-Soviet scholar in the capacity as a rational subject. In other words, the post-Soviet scholars, whether in Central Asia, but also in some cases in the West, remain marginal and within the academia and have to conform to the existing frameworks and existing suggestions and conceptual approaches and methods and tools. Overall, the capacity is limited in Central Asia. Knowledge seems to be of diversity is outdated, and the Soviet post-Soviet scholars are torn between above discourses. They have little exposure to the local framework and methods. When you ask them about what do we have here, it's a quite silence or smile or very little output. The post-Soviet scholars are highly controlled. Their conditions and salary are very poor. And environment is not conducive for critical studies, and research is generally undervalued and has limited connection with policy making. So these are some of the reactions that come from my work in Tajikistan, particularly. What they considered is when I talked about all these above debates, they said that Western is an old Islamic and more recently Soviet. And they brought in people like Nasir Khusraw, Ibn Sina, Biruni, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd, Vygotsky, Krupskaya, Leontiev, and others to prove to me that what the West is bringing back, all these ideas, are not new. They have been used both in terms of pedagogies as well as research methods. So for example, today we see interactive method. The names we use, these are names we use today, but ideas and practices like these were there. Lepetsky method, Brigadny method, these have been transformed and improved upon in the West. This critical thinking idea consists of Soviet educational challenge, analysis, and reflection. So some ideas were born in the Soviet Union, taken to the West, and came back as improved. This is very helpful. So you see, Soviet, and then Russian and Soviet research is not seen as Western. Traditionally, we are post-Soviet, which implies we grew up on the basis of Soviet system. Our thinking, both Soviet and pre-Soviet, are not oriented toward Western. So moving toward Western would require complete transformation of our thinking. These are voices of scholars that I've worked for last 5-10 years in Tajikistan. Some of them say, for example, when I ask them about connecting and learning from South, global South, they say we should not borrow from the Arabs and Arab countries and Pakistan. They have too many problems. We can only borrow problems for them, not solutions. But also, when I critique these neo-Western methods and neoliberalism, they said by critiquing neoliberalism and Western method, you have made Islamic fundamentalists quite happy. So in other words, decolonization critique that I brought at the start that is now taken high level in Africa, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Latin America, and so on, seems to be irrelevant, elitist, and diversion. And Amsler has said this also very interestingly, saying that critiques of global capitalism and liberal ideologies of democracy, long considered as hallmark of post-colonial writing, have little resonance in the new cases in Central Asia, where the colonial past itself was socialist. Currently, so some of these scholars in Tajikistan said, currently we are not able to produce ideas about our society and education. We need to look at what we have elsewhere and assess all that and decide on borrowing. I agree that our students cannot think. I know this from my practice, but in Turkish schools, this was 7, 8 years ago research, they can think independently. So thanks to the borrowing, we now have ideas about disability and disability education. And when they said that the Prophet said Bismillah, Prophet Muhammad, when you say Bismillah or God is one, anything you can take becomes more or less halal. Another scholar said Zamikatsa, self-closure is not good. China is an example. Once they were good, produced porach, gun. Then they closed and became behind. Now they opened and no one can race with them. So these are ideas come from teach. Some of them, as you see, all these problems and diseases we have come from the Western culture. We had none of these during the Soviet times. This culture is alien to us and it leads to corruption and dirty living. In the traditional pre-Soviet and Soviet methods, it is the traditional pre-Soviet and Soviet methods that do not allow or has not allowed us to think. You do not want to borrow new methods that make them think, analyze, and solve problems. You see these contradictory and interesting voices of Tajik scholars coming, talking about whether we should borrow, we should not borrow, whether our tradition should be revived and not revived, and so on. For example, good to talk that we are good and talk about the pride, such as what is wrong with us. Why can't we produce? We produced and West took them. We have Avicenna, Biruni, and so on. But how can we produce? Tell me one way how can we produce ideas? Okay, so in other words, there is no problem with borrowing Western solution and methods that produce this solution. We don't need to design new solutions and method. And we do not even admit that these ideas are imposed on us. So we connect them with traditional post-colonial and critical frameworks. For example, one researcher suggested halakha as methods as replacement for focus group in ethnographic research and linked it with critical theory, which is quite an interesting kind of synthesis. So let's move on. I think I have made it very clear so far. And there is also saying that knowledge is not anyone's property, it is global and we should take it because it travels like air and birds. So what are the implications? The implication, therefore, is that education, research, and knowledge production are still important for recentering Central Asia, for producing local solutions, for enhancing dignity and self-esteem of Central Asia, and for reviving the lost enlightenment, as Frederick Starr said in his book. It is also important that we do not get from decolonization into recolonization of our minds and hearts and bodies. And we do not move from second world into third and fourth world. But it is important that we do not blindly look for solutions for today and the past. These, as Sangeeta Kamat, in the case of India, said, may lead to ethnocentrism, to nationalism, and fundamentalism. For example, Sangeeta Kamat talks about how Indian reaction to globalization and Eurocentrism led to the emergence of Hindu fundamentalism as one of the reactions. And then how it took over under the ethnic nationalism and Hindu fundamentalism, and what kind of inequalities and marginalization it has created. Now, ethnic nationalism, we know, is a question and concern in Central Asia too. But we also need to identify what is indigenous. For example, is Islamic indigenous when these countries existed before and had high-level civilizations before Islam, and when Islam took over and actually removed a lot of what local values and local traditions were? Is Soviet indigenous? If so or not, why and how? This kind of engagement needs to be done. We also need to know if there is one type of colonialism or many colonialism. We should not idealize the indigenous and non-Eurocentrists, including Islam. The indigenous requires reconstruction, not copy and paste of the past. It does not require replacement of Western Orientalism by Oriental Occidentalism, which leads to the furthering of clash of civilizations and into polarization and into self-enclosure. We need to develop in our scholars and of course policymakers reflexivity of modern social life consists in that all ideas and practices in a society are constantly examined and reformed. And it is important that we know that all ideas, whether Western or non-Western, whether religious or not religious, whether sacred or not sacred, whether traditional or not, are constructed by people. They reflect these people's views, their ideas, and therefore they are not final and they are limited, and we need to question them by deciding criteria. For example, we need to also question whether criteria such as justice, equity, quality, diversity, access, which are criteria used for the acceptance of ideas, are relevant, and if yes, so how they work in Central Asia. So we need to create new hybrid and third discourses and third spaces based on constructive and critical analysis of what exists before and what exists now, and have multiple discourses. What is knowledge? Why is it important? Where it comes? Who does it serve? And how could it help us solve our problem? And we need to understand that the task of post-colonial intellectuals, including Central Asians, is to not create bifurcation and oppositions, but to undermine the oppositionality between the East and West that has been created to justify colonialism. So, coming back to in conclusion to the question that Madina Tlostanova put, can post-Soviet thinking produce? What she said is Soviet social sciences is a poor copy-paste of the Western social science, tweaked into progressive Marxist-Leninist liberation ideology, but actually camouflaging neocolonialisms and imperialisms, coming from somewhere else. And we must conclude that so far the post-Soviet space, now what she says, we must conclude that so far the post-Soviet space has not been able to demonstrate to the world and to itself that its inhabitants can indeed think. This does not mean that the situation has to stay like that forever, but there is almost no time left to reverse it. Coloniality of knowledge in the conditions of external imperial difference in Russia, in the USSR, and today, including the darker side of its secondary colonial difference, generates severe stagnation in social sciences, which prevents these disciplines from becoming a part of global science. Final words. So we need to develop education, research, and knowledge production capacity. And this is possible. Indeed, thinking and producing knowledge is possible by Central Asians, by a conscious willingness on the part of the few of the post-Soviet scientists capable of doing it, to decolonize knowledge, get rid of and disallow the epistemic grounds of the rhetoric of modernity and its disciplines and methods, which in the dominant system are presented as the only legitimate ones and they existed forever. And the critical aim of the universities is to shape not a submissive and loyal narrow specialists, not submissive and loyal students and citizens in some applied science, but first of all, a critically thinking, self-reflexive and independent individuals who never accept any ready-made truths at face value and who truly and unselfishly are interested in the world around it in all its diversity and strive to make this world more harmonious, fair for everyone, not only for particularly privileged groups. So just to end up, I spoke with a well-known Central Asian scholars and asked him, how can you address? He said, well, look, we have so many basic living concerns. We think as scholars, but we think about how do I get bread? How do I feed my family? How do I build a house? And so on. So that thought actually stuck in my head as to whether the question is, can they think, or whether the question is, do they have conditions, opportunities, and whether they are allowed to think. So on that notice, I want to thank you. I am done with my presentation today, and thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to discussion. Lushon and Laura, over to you.
Dear Professor, thank you so much for this enlightening and very reflective talk. And before proceeding to the questions and answer session, I would like to give the floor to our Dean, the Dean of Graduate School of Education, Dr. Aida Zagintayeva. Aida Kstabaevna, would you like to say a few words before we proceed to questions and answer session? If Aida Kstabaevna is still with us.
Yeah, I'm with you, but I cannot. Something wrong with my camera. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor, for your interesting lecture. So very impressive. Many names and scholars that you have mentioned, and unfortunately I couldn't find names of Kazakh scholars here. But I do hope that our alumni, our PhD students, and our future PhD students and colleagues will fill this gap and make a very solid research on this topic in the nearest future. I want to take time and want to give the floor to my Yana colleagues for emerging scholars, because it's a great chance for them to communicate with you, and please share your wisdom with them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So let me then read the first question, which was posted in the chat now. So the question is about, so what requirements do Tajik universities have for faculty in terms of PhD numbers? What is the percentage of educators with scientific degrees versus non-degree instructors? So how do they motivate and encourage educators to do research? So that was the first question posted in the chat.
Thank you so much. Well, look, there are two things about this. I think I would not be able to present you the exact numbers, but it is very clear that, for example, in the West, in Canada, we have big number of PhD holders per the population, a very high level. And PhDs are not people who work at universities. There are PhD holders who work in schools. There are PhD holders who work at international organizations. So that is, and I would say that in Central Asia, of course, is the number much smaller. But there are two things about this. One of them is also not the numbers, of course. Numbers is one thing, but also it's the quality of PhD holders, the quality of their production, the quality of their contribution, that is what matters. And that requires, as you said, conditions. We need to create conditions for the scholarship, and scholarship requires freedom of thinking. Universities in the West have academic freedom, and the scholars lead their projects. And also, I want to say that in the West, as you know, there is a huge amount of money devoted to research. There is a belief in research, in independent critical research. For example, you know how much money has been given to the research on COVID itself is just staggering. And look how much of it is given in the West. Now, of course, Central Asian countries, post-Soviet countries are also doing their best. They're giving, and they don't have the capacity and money to give. But generally, the research culture, the culture where people believe in research being able to provide solution is very high. I know that in Tajikistan, for example, there is the money given to research is between 1 to 1.5%, even less than that. Indeed, there is almost very limited scholarship given to PhD students and holders. And this is true also of Pakistan. Niyozov is here. There is only 1 or 1.2% of GDP or even less than that given to research. With that kind of an approach, we will not only fall behind in terms of producing the numbers, but more importantly, the quality, as well as the solution that they provide. I hope I could look at numbers later and respond, but I hope I responded to some extent to your question.
Let me now sequence chat questions with live questions. So I have a colleague, Hamid, raising his hand. Please, Hamid, you're welcome. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
And Sarfaroz, could you close your slide, please?
Oh, yeah.
Sarfaroz, could
you please
what should I do?
Just stop sharing.
Presentation, so
stop
that
sharing.
Yeah. Good. Yes, I know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarfaroz, for this very comprehensive and detailed talk. Production of knowledge, it needs, I believe, in my opinion, a mindset. And that mindset needs to be developed right from the school. But when I think of our culture, your culture, my culture, Central Asian culture, Pakistani culture, I think that's a culture of submission. That's a culture of consumption. From the beginning, we are told to accept without questioning and follow without questioning. Then we live among autocratic regimes who do not encourage questioning. So how these things can impact knowledge production, or how these things can facilitate knowledge production? Any ideas on that?
Well, thank you so much, Hamid. You have actually, yes, these very ideas that you said, well, I've heard them when I was director of the Institute for Education in Pakistan. Indeed, we had students in our class from rural areas, and then we would encourage them to ask questions and to debate critically. And then the students would come. In my research in Pakistan, Niyozov was also part of that research. When I went through data, and when I interviewed these students, already in their second year, this is exactly what they said. They said, Sarfaroz, director side, we have never been allowed or never been encouraged to ask questions from even people, our peers. Forget about parents and forget about teachers. Now you at this institute are pushing us to ask questions and disagree with each other. This is a complete, almost like a opposite of what we have groomed and grown in school and in family, which is, as you said, submission, which is loyalty, non-questioning, and so on. Now, this culture, and I agree with you, will not produce quality. Whatever we put, see, the question of knowledge production, and thank you for this, is not just creating universities, buildings, and structures, and even putting money. It essentially is cultural question. Changing the culture, a culture that allows for freedom of thinking, for questioning, disagreeing, and indeed disagreeing in constructive way, not necessarily negative way, building on what we have. But when these things don't exist, just the question of building universities, developing PhD holders, and all sorts of other things, and putting money will not resolve, and the dependency will continue. So that is a very critical point. The cultural transformation and opening up, particularly at university and school level, that will build into the production of knowledge and quality solutions from the ground. Thank you.
Diamir, so I can unmute you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Sarfaroz. Always a pleasure to listen to you. And your very thoughtful, insightful discussions. My question is, although I have been to, Nazarbayev University for the last, 3+ years, I still am a learner of education in Central Asia. Based on my very limited experience and understanding of education here in Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan, I see that there is a post-Soviet thinking, as you raised in your presentation. I can speak for Kazakhstan. It's not just thinking, it's a very serious thinking. It's a thinking that is led by a quite clear vision, which direction they are going to take. So that is a very positive thing and very encouraging thing that there is a serious thinking. Yes, there is a post-Soviet thinking. However, this thinking is framed by Soviet legacies and the new liberal ideas. So you could see the tension between the two. The Soviet legacy is because there were good things in the Soviet legacy, things that have worked in the past, and things that seem to work at present as well. So there is a certain level of loyalty to that frame of mind. But at the same time, Kazakhstan wants to appear in the world map. So it wants to establish its identity beyond the Soviet borders or the Central Asian borders and interact with the world states. Yes. And that is why there is a huge emphasis on new ideas from North America, from Europe, and our university is the best example of that. We have people from more than 60 countries, and they bring their best practices, best ideas to plant in Kazakhstan. The time will tell, hopefully some of them will work and some of them will open questions for further reflection. So my question is, what would you advise to young researchers that what directions they should take? Should they be carried out by the Soviet legacies or the new liberal ideas, or they can find a mix, a midpoint where they can establish their own identity?
Thank you, Mirafzal. I mean, this is wonderful discussion. I think I agree with you, and as I said, that unlike Klostanova, I do think that post-Soviets, including Central Asians, can think and can produce. And we have examples, and this is one, for example, but there are many other publications that are coming up. One is coming very soon, indeed. I think you have all published. So that's one thing. The second thing is also, I suggested right at the start that the education, research, and knowledge production should be a strategic long-term vision. And I agree with you. And in Kazakhstan in particular, is well situated because of its position, geographic, geopolitical, but also it is economically a strong country. And now, is it the tensions that the Central Asian scholars feel between post-Soviet, Western, and others? Now, you know that the discourses, each of these discourses is itself plural and not one. for example, when you look at the Western, my teachers and scholars, both in Pakistan as well as in Tajikistan, said, what is the problem with critical thinking? What is the problem with early childhood education, disability education, gender equality, cooperative learning? Why cannot we take them from the West and tweak them and contextualize? You remember this discussion. So it is important that we see the diversity of the Western ideas. So is about Soviet. The Soviet experience was not a singular. For example, even in education, there are research that are pedagogical about methods of teaching, but there are also research that led to candidate of philosophy and doctor of philosophy and sociology, which were about larger policy sociology questions. And there were all sorts of things, and ultimately, the Western critical ideas, progressive ideas, are built, ironically, on the Marxist analysis that led to a Soviet experience. So we need to really untangle this. The third one is that we have also national, pre-Islamic and Islamic discourses that also needs to be engaged. We cannot sacralize this. What is important in my suggestion, not just to the scholars of Central Asia, but also to the policy makers, is that we need to develop the constructive critical capacity of Central Asian scholars to engage with this as human constructions and as diverse. And then this encounter, and I'm now reminded, I recall His Highness the Aga Khan's word encounter. The encounter between these discourses needs to be constructively and critically engaged so that the Central Asian produce something that is not going to the past, that's solutions from the past and copy them paste, including Islamic ones. There is not romanticization. It's not ethnic nationalists in the extreme way, but solutions that are grounded in reality and that are also synthesis of what we have from these places. And it does not have to result in one perspective. It could result in plural perspectives. So that is what my suggestion to Central Asian scholars and young scholars particularly is to develop that critical, creative, constructive capacities in them so that they move forward and move Central Asia from the margin and from the periphery to the center, as I wrote in my last chapter of this book. And Kazakhstan in particular is well situated in that. Now, just one more thing. We have now Nazarbayev, we have UCA, we have other universities that are Western. We need to engage critically with their discourses to us in terms of, for example, are we becoming through these universities conduit for reproducing further dependencies, or are we producing new things? Are we moving out of dependence? What I am suggesting is that engage, what I say is that work with, against, and despite the existing global practices. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Razal, for the provocative question.
Thank you, Sarfaroz. Sarfaroz, I think there are a lot of questions. People are ready to ask many questions, but also there are 4 excellent questions in the chat. Can we request you to, when you respond, if possible, can you a little bit make it brief if possible?
Yeah. So where are those questions? Can you tell me where are
Yeah, in the chat, yeah.
Right now? By whom? First by Bakit. Bakit, is that what should be done to not fall from decolonization to recolonization, right? Is this the one?
That's the one, and the second one is also very similar by Anayatova. But Diaz's question, we'll come back to the first question, Diaz's question later on. But Bakut and the Anayatova Dilraba.
Well, let's start with Bakit. Now, Bakit, my dear, I wish I had the answer. This is a question that all post-colonial and anti-colonial, Afrocentrist, South Asianist, post-Soviet, Latin, and all other scholars with critical scholarship, including indigenous scholars in North America, are asking themselves, how do we get out of the knowledge and research method systems into something that is different. And as I said, that the Western Eurocentrist research is not only accused, and I have some problem with this, for reproducing global neoliberal and colonialism, but it is also seen as narrow in the sense of its scientific and empirical focus on looking at not capturing human emotions and human what cannot be captured through science. There are many dimensions to human experience that this approach is believed not to be taken. So what can we do? I think the biggest thing, the only thing I can say is that we need to develop critical constructive capacities that will not, at individual level, that will not allow us to become a follower. Once you get out of this, you can live with what is there. You can live with the existing conditions, but your mental, your emotional, your intellectual capacities should be so that you see any idea, whether it is religious, Western, Soviet, post-Soviet, Central Asian, you see them as human construct. And then you create, on the basis of analysis, your own personal practical philosophy that should lead you to your independence. And once you lead, it leads you to that. You can constructively and critically present those to the society and to the nation. So that is a simple, almost like at the individual level answer. But it requires a lot of other things. It requires thinking by policymakers, and particularly by the elites. You know that the elite of the global South has been a major culprit in reproducing dependency and colonialism because they benefit from it. It reproduces their privilege and power and their enjoyment and their wealth and so on. So the elite itself needs to be critically engaged. But we need to be careful of not being destructive and negative in our criticality. It has to accompany with compassion and caring and constructive approach. So that's my take in responding to you. Now, next question is, can academic research prosper in authoritarian country? Yeah. What about academic freedom in a country where academicians are self-censored? Yes, and I said about this, that is one of the things, as my last comment was that when scholars are channeled to think in a particular way, when conditions are so poor, you know, you had Indy Hargreaves recently, and there is a concept in education and in sociology called proletarianization, and it's a Marxist concept. When teachers are made into proletarians, when they are impoverished, when their lives are intensified to the level that they become implementers and executioners, deprived from conception, deprived from thinking, from making professional decisions, then